Welcome to the Impactus podcast. Today we have a special episode. This podcast first aired in January 2018 with Tim Bergman, lead pastor of Alliance Community Church in Alberta. Typically, the months of January and February see an increase in the number of men who are dealing with mental health issues. The effects of ongoing lockdowns, isolation, job concerns, and more have only made things worse. In this episode, Tim shares his struggles with depression and anxiety and what he's learned along the way, and talks about how men can find hope and healing in the midst of their struggles. So let's go to our Impactus podcast with Tim Bergman.
Tim, I want to say thank you so much for joining us on the Promise Keepers Canada podcast. It is such a thrill to have you be a part of this interview today.
Well, it's a great honor, and I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Tim, as we move into the start of a new year, I know for a lot of Canadian men, the realities of depression will hit them pretty hard as we are in January and February. The winter months just seem to do that and bring it out in a lot of people. And I know that over the last number of years, you've been going through quite a journey as well. And I'm just wondering if you would take a few moments to tell the story a bit of your own battle with depression.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been a public figure for since I was in high school, and used to being in front of people, used to being strong and energetic and charismatic, and all of these things. And then in 1998, I was 32 years old, 33, somewhere in there. And I had my first sort of introduction to depression, and it left me not being able to be with people. This overwhelming sense of sadness and a darkness and despair, was so difficult. I struggle also with anxiety disorder as well, and so those two things kind of they did this terrible dance together in my soul, and over the years it's ebbed and flowed. It would come back again, and sometimes just so dark and so difficult. My last, couple big bouts were one was in probably March of 2017, and then before that was probably November of 2016. So it's recent, and I wish I could say that I'm through it, that I would never experience it again, but I don't. I'm not living under that illusion that it could come back again at some other time. And when it does, it's just it's pretty intense. It feels for me like my physical manifestation. It feels like a steel ball the size of a medicine ball growing inside my chest, and it. You feel like you can hardly breathe. Like you think some bad thoughts. You can think, why am I here? What's my purpose? It'd be better off if I wasn't around. Those kind of dark thoughts. So,
man, that is quite a picture that you paint of that steel ball building up inside of you. And I don't know that every person can relate and say, man, that's been my experience, either for myself or somebody else. And I know that sometimes you talk about how people will sometimes compare one person's experience of suffering with another person's experience. And, when that happens, sometimes we downplay the depression that people around us might be facing and going, it's not that bad.
Right.
Because mine's been far worse. or maybe the opposite can be true. It can result in, me feeling like, man, I am way worse off than what other people are. I am worthless and useless, and I'm having far more suffering than other people are facing in the world. Do you think it's fair to actually compare one person's experiences of suffering with someone else's?
Yeah, it does. Mostly it does no good, right?
Yeah. And
everybody's story is unique to themselves. There's a great verse in Hebrews chapter 12 that says, "Run the race marked out for you." And that's meant a lot to me this last little while as I've been thinking about that you sort of get this feeling that we're all in the same race, and it's who's ahead of who's behind who, and that's just a silly way to think. We're on a race that's uniquely marked out for us. And my race is different than your race, Kirk. So it doesn't matter where you are on your race because yours is different than mine. Here, though, is in general, it doesn't make any sense. First of all, I don't have a clue what's going on in another person's life. I have no way of knowing what their pain level is like. So it does no good to compare. It also does no good to compare if it makes my suffering worse, right?
Right.
That doesn't help me at all. That just, if I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I shouldn't be whining, complaining, or oh my goodness, my situation is so much worse than everybody else's, that does nothing to help me get through it. And there's enough struggle already with depression than to be adding that to it. It does help if it spurs me on. So I had kidney failure as well in the last 3 years ago. I had a kidney transplant, and I remember being on dialysis and hating dialysis. Man, I hate dialysis. But there was this guy next to me named John who had been on. So I had to be on it for like 5 months or something like this. He was on it for 32 years.
Wow.
Okay. So I'd show up hating dialysis, but I'd say, "Good morning, John." He goes, "Hi, good morning," with a big smile on his face, and I'm like, "All right, I can dig it out a lot. I can. It helps if it spurs me on to say, I could dig a little deeper today because someone else I know is suffering and they're digging in. Then I think it's good. Then it helps me. But if it's not helping me, then it's just a waste of time."
That's a good word and a great perspective about the importance of running your own race that God's laid out for you. And we live in this kind of comparison culture all the time. Right. Social media is all about this comparison mindset. And even, when it comes to jobs and the size of home you have and the size of truck you drive, it's this constant comparison culture. And we don't realize sometimes the lies that we believe that drive us even deeper into some of these despairs because we are living in this comparison culture. So thank you for that.
And when you're suffering with depression, you can look around and go, "Oh man, if I just lived that guy's life, it would be better. If I didn't have to carry this load." But actually, you don't want to run anybody else's race because this race has been marked out. So it's been thoughtful. It's been, God is careful in when he marks out the race for me. It's unique. It's specific. Mine happens to have, my race involves a great wife and 6 fantastic kids with their own issues and struggles. And it also involves kidney disease and stress and anxiety and job loss and financial ruin. And right? So this is my unique race that God has carved out for me. And it's thoughtful. It's not done randomly. It's not done like, whatever. God has said, no, this is how I want a race for you to run. I don't want to run anybody else's race. It would be worse to run anybody else's race.
You refer to God there, but I think that there's a lot of guys, especially Christian guys, who sometimes when they're facing depression, one of the questions that you'll hear is, where is God?
Oh, totally.
We kind of live in this environment that says that everything, when you're walking with God, everything's okay. And so what do you say to a man or even a woman who's listening to this, who might be facing depression and they're thinking to themselves, where is God in all of this? How would you answer that question?
Well, and I think that's part of it. Part of the depression is the loneliness, and God can feel far away, and I think it's great to ask God that question. I think He's big enough for us to ask that question.
Agreed.
And to wrestle through that, and not to just sort of not to be afraid of that. I remember I had a son when he was little, and he had just taken something and was hiding it behind his back, and I said, "What's behind your back?" And he said, "Nothing." Well, I knew what was behind his back. Like, I'm not stupid, right? But I needed him to admit it. And so God sometimes says to us, "How you doing?" And we go, "Fine." And He's like, "Come on, seriously. I know how you're doing. I want you to tell me how you're doing, to admit it. To say, God, I feel far away from you. To say, wake up, where are you?" Psalms are filled with this kind of language. And we can feel uncomfortable saying those kind of things. But God understands that. Christ says to the disciples, listen to this for depression verse. How does this sound? He says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." That is what depression feels like. Mm-hmm. My soul overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And so this is the Christ who knows and understands and is with us. He's present. And Psalm 139 says, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. And that's another way I would describe depression, is making my bed in the depths. But he is there. He is with us. And yep, it would be really nice if he just snapped a finger and make all this stuff go away. But there are incredibly beautiful things that happen, that we experience in those dark times. And man, when I finally can come to grips with the fact that God is with me. See, if I'm an orphan and I have no one on my side, then I'd better claw and scrape and fight and get everything I possibly can. But if I'm adopted, Scripture says I'm adopted, that I'm a child of God. We sign the papers, everything's good to go. If I'm adopted and my Father loves me, then somehow this is all, I want to say okay. I say that carefully because it's not a light like, oh, no, it's no problem. Oh, it's a huge problem. I get that. But there's something about I can trust God in the midst of all of that.
Yeah, that's a good word. And I appreciate that because it's not the trite answer of everything's going to be just okay. Which kind of leads me to my next question, because I think we do live in this culture of almost bargaining with God, that if I'm fully obedient to God and I'm doing my best to be the best Christian I can be, then everything should be good in my life.
Totally. Yeah, we work out this deal.
Right.
You know,
and so,
I do this stuff for you, you give me protection.
Exactly.
Right?
so people who are living in the midst of depression, sometimes, I mean, I've heard horror stories of people who, well-meaning Christians, who will come and say, well, there must be some deep sin in your life that's causing this, because God wouldn't be making you go through this if there wasn't. And then there's the other, just the internal thought process of the person going through depression who is legitimately saying, God, what have I done wrong that I'm experiencing this? I'm trying to do my best to be obedient to you. Why is this happening to me? How do you respond to Christians who are having that kind of argument with themselves and with God?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's probably where my struggle was. I added much extra suffering in my life by constantly going, what have I done? Let me change. I'll do whatever you need me to do, God, so that you will fix this and take this away. And it's all the contract, back to the contract. Let's work out a deal here, you know. And if I need to do more on my end, just so you'll do something to relieve my suffering. And God is not a contract God. He's not a contractual God. He is a covenant God. And he promises that he'll love us. He also pulls no punches, that we will experience suffering. And so I asked God, this is a very personal question for people. Why is this happening to me? Right? Very, very personal. And it comes to that question, why do bad things happen to good people? And what I'm basically saying is, hey, I'm good people, right? And I felt like God asked me a couple questions. He said, that's a great question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Here's a couple more. Why do good things happen to good people? And what do you mean by good people? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the correct question is say, why would a bad thing happen to a perfect person? To a person that's never done anything ever to deserve any suffering? The reality is, I'm not a good person. You know, it's amazing that good things happen to me. Suffering is a common language to all people. It doesn't matter what your faith is, or if you have no faith. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter where you live. Suffering is a common language to all people. Mm-hmm. And it's a common language to Jesus Christ, who in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, became one of us, walked amongst us, and that came with suffering. Hebrews says, son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And so we are all in this together. It is a part of life. It's not personal. It doesn't have to be. I think sometimes we can learn from it. There's obviously things we can pick up. So part of my suffering, part of my depression, anxiety, has to do with incorrect thinking on my part. Okay? So as a kid, I remember making some kind of vow saying, no one will ever be disappointed in me again, because of an experience that I had. So that kind of mindset helped to shape my workaholism. I'm a workaholic. There you go. I'm just admitting it here on this podcast. And because of being a workaholic, that does not do good things for my soul. So part of my suffering is my own foolish way of thinking. The other part of my suffering is the chemical imbalance in my body, which I have no control over, actually. Right? So it's just a complicated thing. There's things I can learn, I can do different. There's other things about my depression, anxiety that I just have to live with and work with. And God has much to do in my life to shape me and mold me and care for me. I remember feeling like, I've just been set aside. God has set me aside. Everybody else is able to keep going, do their jobs, make their money, be significant, and I'm set aside. And I think people in depression can feel that way, right? That the river is flowing next to them and they're in a stale pool of water off to the side. And talked with this one spiritual director one time, and he said to me, do you feel closer or farther away from God through this whole experience? And I remember feeling like, wow, it's been so dark. When every breath is a prayer to God, when you're suffering, that's how it is. Boy, I feel I've experienced God's presence. I feel closer to Him. I feel more loved by Him through it all. And he said, I wonder then if instead of saying you're set aside, if you could look at this whole season as being set apart. And that was beautiful to me. The one word change gave dignity to all the difficulty and suffering. That God is setting me apart to suffer. And in that time, I meet Him in such deep ways, in such desperate ways. And He looks at me with understanding. He goes, I know what you're going through. I'm sorry you have to go through this, son. I love you and I'm with you.
Those are some attitudes that you really have to try and choose when you're in the middle of suffering like that. But in order to choose those attitudes, there have to be some foundational things that you just know for sure in your heart, right? Like when you're facing depression, life can feel really hopeless, and you need some foundational fundamentals that help to give you hope and strength to be able to move forward and to shape the attitudes that you're going to have in the midst of the suffering. And so for you, what are some of the fundamental things that you had to kind of come to or come back to that provided that foundation for you to be able to shape your attitudes and to shape how you were going to walk through the suffering?
Yeah, for sure. For me, just to admit that life is hard. Life is filled with suffering and nobody gets a free ride. Okay, so once I could agree with that, because it was such a personal affront to me, that I'm having to suffer, because you sort of feel like if I'm really good, then I get inoculated from suffering. But no, actually, welcome it. We all are going to face it. So that's humbling, and it helps me to see a little bit clearer. The second thing is to realize that this life isn't all there is. And you know what? One day I'm going to stand on the threshold of eternity, and I'm going to look down that unending highway where Jesus says there'll be no more pain or sorrow or suffering or grief. He'll wipe away every tear from our eyes. I'm going to look down an eternal road of that. And maybe by God's grace, I'll have a chance to look back at this life, which in comparison to eternity is a short moment. And I wonder if I might say, I could have suffered more. I could have handled it more. You could put me back in if I can be of better use to you, or because it's a heavenly perspective, and it's not that this life it doesn't take away the sorrow and the pain, but it helps me put it into perspective, helps me to endure just a little bit longer. If I'm guaranteed that someone's going to give me $1 million in January 1, it helps me to endure a bill problem in December 25, right?
Yep.
That kind of thing. So that's definitely the heavenly perspective has been very, very helpful to me. And finally, just that what's my favorite name for God is Emmanuel, God with us. Mary had a baby, and they said they will call him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. All this was to confirm what the prophet said. The virgin will have a child, and they will call him Emmanuel. And so I love this about God, that he is with me. And Psalm 91 says, it's a great psalm that talks about all these sort of wonderful things that God will do. But there's this verse right near the end that says, I will be with him in trouble. And that's really all I want in this life, is to be with God. That's the main thing. And so in so many ways, I'm living the dream with job loss and success loss and money loss and health loss and all of those things. I'm living the dream because God is with me.
Tim, I just want to say thank you for your honesty and your transparency, and also how you have helped to just how you've helped all of us to be able to refocus and take our eyes off of present suffering and put our eyes back on the one who gives us hope. And I think, you probably didn't realize this, and maybe don't even realize it right now, but all of the things that you've experienced over the last number of years, and the dark waters and deep waters that you have gone through, and the dark paths that you've experienced, I just really believe that God's going to use this story and the truths of his word that you are bringing in front of us today to help give somebody somewhere some hope that God has not forgotten them. And
could I say something just to those people?
Absolutely. I would love for you to say something.
So my brother or sister who's out there struggling with depression, I just want to say I am so sorry for the difficult road you're having to walk. I know how hard it is. And all you need to do is get through today. Don't worry about tomorrow. Don't worry about next month or next year. There's enough grace for you today. Get through today. God is with you.
That's a good word to end this on, Tim. Thank you so much for sharing your story today. I appreciate it.
Okay, take care.
Thanks for listening to the Impactus podcast. To learn more about living a life of purpose and godly impact, check out impactus.org.